In the U.S., over half of older parents say they rarely see their adult children once those kids get married. My grandfather was one of them, and what he did next shocked the entire family. My name is Ethan. I am 29. My grandfather Walter is 78. He served in the Navy when the ships still sang with steel and salt. He has been a widower for a long time. He lives alone in a cedar-sided house that smells like coffee and motor oil. When I was little, he never missed a birthday. He would show up with a pocket knife wrapped in newspaper or a model airplane to glue together on the porch. He taught me to tie a bowline with my eyes closed. He taught me that a promise is a rope. It either holds or it snaps. After his children married, the rope started to fray. At first it was small, a missed Saturday, a text that said next week. Then months went by. The porch swing kept moving, but only with the wind. The phone sat on the counter like a quiet witness. I would visit and see the light blinking with voicemails. I would press play and hear him say the same gentle line. Call me when you get a minute. No rush. I am fine. He was not fine. He was lonely in a way that does not make noise. It is the kind of lonely you feel when the house creaks at 2 a.m. and nobody says bless you after a sneeze. It is the kind you swallow because you do not want to be a burden. He would shrug and say, "People are busy." He would say it the way a sailor reads a bad forecast. Calm voice, tight jaw. I loved him and I tried to show up. I brought groceries and we changed the oil in his truck, even though he drove it once a week. We played chess, and he still beat me with the same patient trap on move 12. He kept my childhood drawings in a cigar box and pretended not to know I knew. He asked about my job and my rent, and whether I was eating enough real food. He rarely asked about his other children. When he did, he used past tense by accident. Your mother always loved the ocean. Your uncle liked fireworks on the 4th. He would catch himself and smile like a man who bumps a bruise. The Sunday that set everything in motion was bright and windless. Church bells carried across the road. I brewed him coffee in his chipped navy mug. He looked at the framed photo of my grandmother by the window. Then he looked at the silent phone. He said a sentence I will never forget. We promise to be there until life gets busy. Then busy turns into never. He did not say it in anger. He said it like a weather report. I could feel a question rising in my chest, and I knew older people who might hear this would feel it too. We like to believe we will be different. We like to believe our calendars will bend for love. But calendars do not bend by themselves. Someone has to pick up the pen. He poured more coffee. He asked about my week. He changed the subject like a gentleman. The house was quiet. The rope was still there. It had not snapped yet, but I could hear it strain. We promised to be there for our parents until life gets busy. But at what point does busy just become an excuse? After my grandfather's children got married, the visits began to shrink. At first they came every couple of weeks. Then it became once every few months. Then the calendar rolled through an entire year without a single knock at his door from any of them. I would stop by and find his voicemail light blinking again. Each message sounded the same. Hey Dad, we'll visit soon. Life's just a little crazy right now. Soon. Soon never came. The way he handled it was almost more heartbreaking than the absence itself. He never cursed. He never accused. He just made excuses for them as if covering for soldiers who had abandoned their post. People are busy, Ethan, he would say. It's not easy with kids and jobs. But I could see in the way he paused between sips of coffee that it stung. His house had become a time capsule. The photographs on the walls hadn't been updated in years. The framed school pictures of my mom and uncles still showed them in their 20s, smiling with the promise of a future that apparently no longer included their father. The fridge held milk, eggs, and the kind of leftovers you can stretch across 3 dinners when you're cooking for one. Then came his 78th birthday. I called him early that morning to tell him I'd be by later. He sounded cheerful, but in that overly polite way people do when they're trying to hide something. I asked if anyone else was coming. He said, "Oh, everyone's busy. I'm sure they'll call." When I arrived in the afternoon, the driveway was empty except for his old truck and a dented bicycle leaning against the porch. Sitting on the steps was Jake, the neighbor from 3 houses down. He was 32, built like a guy who works with his hands, with sunburned skin and a permanent squint from too many hours outdoors. He had a small white box in his lap, a store-bought cake with "Happy Birthday, Walt" written in shaky blue icing. "Afternoon, Ethan," Jake said, standing to shake my hand. "Figured the old man could use some company." Inside, the 3 of us sat around the kitchen table. The sunlight cut across the wood in gold stripes. Jake told stories about fishing with my grandfather when he was a kid. He even pulled a photo from his pocket, my grandfather 10 years younger kneeling on the dock, showing a scrawny teenage Jake how to tie a leader knot. I had never seen that picture before. It hit me then that Jake had known my grandfather in ways I hadn't realized. Not as a distant neighbor who waved from across the yard, but as someone who'd been welcomed into this house long before the rest of the family stopped coming. The phone didn't ring once that day. No texts, no surprise visits. Just the 3 of us, sharing cake that was more frosting than sponge, and laughing about the time my grandfather's dog had stolen Jake's sandwich during a fishing trip. When I left that evening, Jake was still on the porch with him. They were leaning back in their chairs, talking about nothing and everything. For the first time in months, my grandfather's laugh filled the air, and I realized how long it had been since I'd heard it without a trace of bitterness. That birthday could have been a wound that cut deeper. Instead, Jake's presence made it something else entirely. The start of a bond that, though unexpected, was about to change everything. The days after that birthday felt different around my grandfather's place. I'd stop by and see signs that someone had been there. A pile of fresh-cut wood stacked neatly by the shed, the old fence gate swinging straight again instead of sagging on one hinge. Sometimes I'd find muddy boot prints on the porch that weren't mine. Jake had become a fixture in my grandfather's world. Not just the kind of neighbor who waves from a distance, but someone who stepped over the threshold and stayed. He would swing by after work to patch a loose shingle or haul trash to the curb, then linger for a cup of coffee in the dim kitchen light. They'd sit across from each other like 2 soldiers swapping stories long after the battle had ended. One afternoon, I pulled into the driveway and caught them mid-laugh. They were on the porch, leaning back in mismatched chairs, a checkerboard between them. The air smelled of pine and motor oil. My grandfather's head was thrown back, the sound of his laugh rolling into the yard like it hadn't in years. Jake slapped the table, pretending outrage at being beaten yet again. I stepped closer and caught a piece of their banter. "You cheated, Walt. I saw that move." "Cheating is just strategy with a bad reputation." My grandfather grinned, sliding another checker into place. It was strange, in the best way, to see him like that. No guarded smile, no polite deflection. Just joy, plain and unfiltered. The kind you don't fake when no one's watching. Later, as we cleared the board, I asked him if it bothered him, the silence from his children. His hands paused over the pieces. He didn't look up when he answered. "People make time for what matters to them, Ethan. That's the truth of it. Always has been." The words were simple, but the weight behind them settled over me like a heavy coat. He didn't sound angry. He sounded resolved. Like a man who'd stopped waiting for a ship that wasn't coming. I glanced at Jake, who was rinsing mugs in the sink like he'd done it 100 times before. He wasn't a guest here anymore. He was part of the rhythm, the quiet footsteps in the hall, the extra chair pulled out at dinner, the voice that filled in the empty spaces left behind by those who had drifted away. That evening, I stayed for dinner. Jake fried up trout they'd caught that morning. My grandfather told me the story, how Jake had stubbornly stood in freezing water just to net one decent fish, how they'd nearly tipped the boat when the line snapped. His eyes lit up with each detail, like he was reliving it in real time. When I left, the porch light followed me down the steps. In the rearview mirror, I saw them still sitting there, two silhouettes against the warm glow from the kitchen. One old, one young, bound by something deeper than a shared fence line. It struck me then, blood might connect you, but presence keeps you alive in each other's stories. And in that moment, Jake was showing up in ways that some family never would. It was late March when I pulled into my grandfather's driveway and saw a car I didn't recognize. A black sedan, polished to a mirror, with a small brass plate on the dashboard that read, "Carter and Bloom, Attorneys at Law." For a moment, I thought maybe he was finally sorting out some paperwork about the house, something routine. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew it wasn't just routine. He was at the dining table, the same table where we'd eaten countless Sunday dinners. Papers were spread across it in neat stacks, each marked with yellow tabs. A man in a gray suit sat across from him, pen in hand, his leather briefcase open like a silent witness. My grandfather looked up and smiled, calm but deliberate. "Ethan," he said, motioning me over. "You're just in time. I'm making a few adjustments." The attorney introduced himself as Mr. Carter, then slid a document toward my grandfather. I caught a glimpse of the title, Last Will and Testament. But underneath it were more pages labeled Living Trust, Durable Power of Attorney, and Healthcare Proxy. This wasn't just a will. This was everything. My grandfather's hands were steady as he signed each page. He didn't pause. He didn't look for reassurance. When Mr. Carter stepped away to make a phone call, I leaned closer. "What's going on?" I asked. He rested the pen on the table and looked me straight in the eye. "I'm making sure my house, my savings, and what's left of my Navy pension go to someone who's been here when it counts." I felt the words before I understood them. "You mean Jake?" He nodded. "Yes, Jake." It wasn't spite in his voice. It wasn't anger toward his children. It was something quieter, heavier. A decision made in the still hours when you're staring at the ceiling, asking yourself who would actually show up if you called at 2 a.m. "I kept records, Ethan," he said, tapping a leather-bound notebook. "Every visit. Every call that wasn't returned. 20 years worth. And I'm tired of pretending that love is automatic just because of blood." I glanced at the notebook, neat handwriting filling page after page, dates and times underlined, small notes in the margins. Left voicemail. No response. Promised to come by. Didn't. Jake dropped off soup. Stayed an hour. He told me he'd also recorded a video statement with Mr. Carter, explaining the decision in his own words. So no one could claim he was coerced or confused. There was a clarity in his tone that didn't leave room for argument. "You think they'll be upset?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. "They'll be furious," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "But if this was about money, they had 20 years to earn it before Jake ever did." Outside, the wind rattled the fence Jake had fixed months earlier. The house felt both fragile and unshakable at the same time, like it was bracing for a storm that would come in the form of angry phone calls and bitter accusations. I sat there for a while, not saying much, just listening to the scratch of his pen as he signed the final page. In that moment, I realized he wasn't cutting his family out of his life. They had cut themselves out a long time ago. When I left, the attorney's car was still in the driveway. My grandfather stood at the porch railing, one hand resting on the wood, watching me like a man who'd finally tied the last knot in a rope he could trust. It happened sooner than I thought it would. Barely a week had passed when the first tremor ran through the family. My Aunt Linda dropped by my grandfather's house one rainy afternoon, claiming she was there to help him sort through old insurance files. Linda was the kind of person who could never resist a half-open drawer, and my grandfather, for all his decisiveness, had never been the best at locking things away. Somewhere between the stacks of faded envelopes and the coffee tins full of nails, she found it. The updated will. I imagine her standing in the hallway, the pale light from the window falling across the papers, her lips moving as she read, the name Jake Turner appearing again and again in clean black ink where she expected her own. She must have stood there a long time, listening to the rain tick against the glass. And then she left, not quietly, but with the quick, clipped steps of someone who'd found something they couldn't unsee. That night, my phone buzzed until it felt warm in my pocket. The family group chat, usually silent for weeks, had exploded. "Have you heard? Dad's giving it all to some neighbor. He's not thinking clearly. Jake's manipulating him. We have to do something." By the next morning, the kitchen at my grandfather's house felt different, tight, as if the walls had drawn a little closer. He sat at the table with a half-full mug of coffee, the will folded neatly beside him like an unspoken dare. His phone lay between us, screen lighting up every few minutes with another name from his children. I watched him answer one call. His voice was calm, steady, almost too polite. "Yes, I know exactly what I signed. No, I wasn't pressured. Yes, it's legal." Then came a pause, followed by, "If you'd like to visit, my door's open." He hung up without waiting for an answer. By evening, they had arranged what they called a family discussion, a speakerphone conference that filled the kitchen with voices sharp enough to cut. "Dad, you barely know this guy. You're giving away everything we're supposed to inherit? What about your own children?" The light outside had gone copper with the setting sun, throwing long shadows across the table. My grandfather sat in that fading light like a man carved from it, his hands folded, eyes fixed on the fence Jake had mended months ago. When the accusations finally slowed, he spoke. "If this was about money," he said quietly, "my own kids had 20 years to show up before Jake ever did." The silence on the line was thick, like the air before a summer storm. I don't know if it was guilt, disbelief, or anger that kept them quiet, but for a moment the only sound was the tick of the clock over the sink. Then the voices came again, softer now, full of excuses about distance, about busy lives, about how it wasn't personal. He listened to every one of them, his face unreadable, and when they were done, he simply said, "Neither is this." When the call ended, he poured the rest of his coffee into the sink and rinsed the mug. Outside, the sky had turned the color of old steel. I stood there, realizing that nothing they said now could change the current. He had already chosen where the rope would be tied. From the porch, you could see Jake's place down the road, a single light glowing in the window. My grandfather looked at it for a long time before turning in for the night, his shadow stretching across the floor like the quiet end of a long day. A few days after the family call, the air around my grandfather's house felt heavier, but not in a way that chased Jake away. If anything, he was there more often, fixing a stubborn back door hinge, replacing a cracked pane in the shed window, bringing over stew when the evenings turned cold. One afternoon, I sat with my grandfather on the porch as he whittled a piece of cedar down to a smooth, curved shape. The scent of fresh wood curled into the air. I asked him, maybe for my own understanding, why Jake? Why not me? or anyone else in the family who still came around. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed with the tip of his knife toward the far end of the yard, where the fence line dipped slightly before meeting the trees. "That's where Jake learned to cast a fishing line," he said. He was 12. His mother had just left. Never knew his father. "Came over here one day with a rod so tangled it looked like a bird's nest." I could see it as he spoke, a skinny kid with sunburned cheeks, looking unsure of how long he could stay before someone told him to leave. My grandfather had handed him a sandwich and a glass of milk, then spent the afternoon teaching him knots and patience in equal measure. "He was a quiet kid," my grandfather continued. "But when he came back, he always brought something, a jar of nails he'd found, an old wrench, sometimes just a story about school. He wasn't family by blood, but he acted like it mattered to show up." His voice changed when he told me about the night his health took a bad turn. It was last winter, past midnight, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones. He'd woken up with his chest tight, breath coming in shallow pulls. He'd called each of his children, one by one. No answer, not even voicemail, just rings that dissolved into silence. "I called Jake last," he said. "He was here in 6 minutes, car still warm when we pulled into the ER. The image sank into me. Jake in boots and a worn jacket, hair still damp from sleep, one hand steadying my grandfather as the other pushed open the hospital doors. No questions, no hesitation, just presence. The screen door creaked and Jake stepped onto the porch carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one in front of my grandfather and grinned. "Told you that back door needed a new hinge." They fell into easy conversation, the kind where you don't need to fill every silence. I watched them, one old, one young, bound by years of small, consistent acts. It wasn't a friendship born of grand gestures. It was built the way a craftsman builds a boat, plank by plank, nail by nail, until one day it floats without question. As the sun slid low, casting long bands of amber across the yard, I realized something. My grandfather's will wasn't about money or punishment or making a point. It was about choosing to leave what he had to the person who had already proven, time and again, that they would be there when it mattered most. The coffee steamed between them, the air cooling with the evening. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of Jake's hammer rang out faintly from the shed, a rhythm that felt, in its own way, like the steady heartbeat of this place. My grandfather passed away on a morning so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. The sun hadn't yet climbed over the pines, and a light frost clung to the porch rail like it didn't want to let go. Jake was the one who called me, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a man who'd just lost someone who mattered. By the time I arrived, the house smelled faintly of the cedar my grandfather used to whittle and the coffee he'd brewed before bed. Jake was sitting at the table, his hands wrapped around a cold mug, the will and a stack of neatly labeled envelopes beside him. He had already called the lawyer. He had already called the funeral home. He had already done the things that, in another life, might have been handled by his children. The funeral was small, just as my grandfather had wanted. A simple service at the old church down the road, the one with peeling white paint and hymnals older than me. Jake sat in the front pew, his hands clasped, the brim of his hat resting on his knee. I looked around and realized none of my grandfather's children were there. Not one. Instead, they sent emails. Long, blistering emails demanding to review the will, accusing Jake of manipulation, claiming they'd been cut out unfairly. Mr. Carter, the attorney, replied to each with the same calm precision. The documents were valid, witnessed, and accompanied by a video statement in which my grandfather explained his decision in clear, unwavering words. After the service, we went back to the house. Jake made coffee and pulled a small cedar box from the top shelf of the hall closet. Inside was a folded American flag, the one presented to my grandfather when he retired from the Navy, and an envelope with my name on it. I sat at the table where he'd signed the will and opened the letter. His handwriting was neat, deliberate, the same as in his leather-bound notebook. Ethan, you were the only family who never made me feel alone. I want you to take care of Jake the way he's taken care of me. The house is his now, but the stories, the memories, they're ours to keep alive. Don't let anyone tell you blood is the only thing that makes a family. Sometimes it's the least important part. I read it twice before folding it back into the envelope. Outside, Jake was on the porch, talking quietly to one of the neighbors who'd come to pay respects. His shoulders were squared, but his eyes looked older than they had a week ago. That evening, we sat in the living room, the cedar box between us. The only light came from the lamp my grandfather had fixed so many times I'd lost count. Jake ran his hand over the folded flag and said, "He saved me long before I ever had the chance to return the favor." The wind picked up outside, rattling the fence again, but this time it didn't sound fragile. It sounded solid, like something built to last. I knew then that my grandfather's choice wasn't just an act of gratitude. It was his final way of making sure the person who showed up for him would never feel the same loneliness he had. And in that quiet room, with the flag between us and his words still warm in my hands, I promised myself I'd keep that rope tied tight. It's been months since we buried my grandfather, but there are mornings when I still expect to hear the low creak of his porch swing when I drive up the road. The cedar house looks the same, paint weathered, roof steady, but now it's Jake's laughter that slips through the screen door, Jake's boots that thump across the porch boards. I stop by more often now, not out of obligation, but because I want to. The first time I visited after the funeral, Jake had left my grandfather's Navy mug on the kitchen counter, coffee ring still fresh. He didn't move it when I came in. He just nodded toward the chair I'd always taken and said, "Coffee's still hot." It was as if we were both holding a space for him, a seat at the table no one else could fill. We've settled into a rhythm. Sometimes I help Jake with repairs around the place, sanding the railings, fixing the gutter, splitting firewood before the cold comes. Other days, we just sit on the porch, drinking coffee in the quiet way my grandfather liked best. And every so often, Jake will tell a story I've never heard before, about the first time my grandfather took him fishing at dawn, or the time they rebuilt the shed roof in a rainstorm, because a man shouldn't let a job go half done. Those stories have become a kind of currency between us, proof that my grandfather's life was built on more than years and possessions. It was built on the people he chose to show up for, and the rare few who showed up for him. The rest of the family hasn't spoken to Jake since the will was read. They sent more emails at first, but Mr. Carter's responses never changed. The document stood, the video statement was clear, and there was nothing to contest. Eventually, the noise faded, replaced by a silence that, in its own way, says everything. I've thought a lot about that silence, about how absence isn't neutral. It leaves marks just as deep as presence does. My grandfather didn't push his children away. He simply stopped pretending they were still close. It's an uncomfortable truth, one that people don't like to say out loud, but I think he wanted it to be part of the lesson he left behind. One evening, Jake and I were going through an old box of my grandfather's things when I found the leather-bound notebook. The pages were as neat as the day I first saw them. Dates, times, and small notes in the margins. Besides some entries, he'd drawn tiny check marks. I realized those weren't marks of disappointment. They were acknowledgments of the rare times someone had shown up. Jake's name appeared often. Mine was there too, fewer times than his, but enough to make me close the book with a quiet kind of pride. Later, sitting out on the porch, I asked Jake if he ever felt awkward inheriting the house. He shook his head slowly. This place isn't just a house. It's where I learned what it means to keep your word. You don't inherit that, you carry it. His words stayed with me. Looking out over the yard, I thought about all the times we say we'll be there for someone, the easy promises we make when it costs nothing. Life gets busy, work piles up, families grow. But one day you look up and realize years have passed, and the person you once promised to visit is sitting in a quiet house with a phone that hasn't rung in weeks. My grandfather's choice wasn't a punishment. It was an answer to a question most people don't ask until it's too late. Who actually shows up? And when you measure love not in words, but in time, in footsteps up the porch steps, in coffee shared across a worn kitchen table, the answer is clearer than you think. As the last light faded that night, Jake stood and switched on the porch lamp. The warm glow spilled over the railing, the same way it had when my grandfather used to wait for me to pull into the drive. I realized then that some legacies aren't about bloodlines or bank accounts. They're about who holds the light for you when you're still a mile down the road. Family isn't just who you're born to. It's who shows up when life gets quiet. And if you don't want to be replaced, don't disappear. If someone wrote their will today, would your name be there because of blood or because you earned it?